Good afternoon and a really warm welcome to you all. It's really fantastic to see so many people here. I confess we were all rather anxious about filling this auditorium when we found this was going to be the venue, so close to Christmas and everything else. But seeing you all here, I think, really speaks to the huge importance of this topic. It feels right now, if one looks at the news cycle, and undeniably one of the most pressing issues of our time. So I'm just going to give you a little overview of what you're going to be hearing today, this afternoon, a little sort of run through of the agenda, and also, first of all, actually, some housekeeping, the fire exit. I've been told there are two. On the floor that we're on the ground on this lower level here and up at the top, and essentially if we do hear an alarm, we've just got to make our way out the way we came in, through the front, cross the traffic lights, over the taxi rank, and apparently there'll be a welcome officer with bells and whistles to guide you in his direction. So that's housekeeping. Right, so for this afternoon, we are going to hear from the series authors. I hope actually you've all got a copy of the Lancet, and if you haven't, please do pick up one at the end of the event. This is a Lancet special issue we've done for advancing racial and ethnic equity in science, medicine and global health, and the series we're going to hear about today makes actually a very substantial second part of the entire issue. Each of the authors, you're going to hear about their papers. There's going to be a panel discussion, which I'll be chairing, and then, no, that's the wrong order, sorry, there'll be a recorded discussion, a recorded film between Dylan and some authors from Brazil, India and South Korea, who are going to be talking about some of the main problems related to racism in those countries and the health consequences. Then there'll be the panel with the authors, and then there'll be a second panel which will be comprised of some external authors and myself, and we hope in both of the panel discussions that we'll be getting questions from you, as well as this is being webcast, so we've got people online. So do think up some good questions for the Q&A and the discussions later. But first, I'd like to introduce you to Richard Horton, Editor-in-Chief of The Lancet, who's going to give some opening remarks. Richard.
Well done, So that was my colleague, Dr. Pamela Das, who, along with our Deputy Editor, Dr. Astrid James, who's in the audience, and a cast of almost 50 people working at The Lancet, with our authors, put this theme issue together. So let me add my welcome and thanks for coming today. This is a day that for us at The Lancet really is extremely significant. Tomorrow is Human Rights Day, and that's the official publication date of the issue of the journal that you have in front of you. And I should start off really by being very clear about our own position, because The Lancet is a journal that was launched almost 200 years ago, 1823, so next year is our 200th anniversary, and we were launched as an explicit part of this country's colonial enterprise. If you read the opening editorial of the first issue of The Lancet, written by Thomas Wackley, he actually names colonial practitioners as one of the key audiences for the journal. Indeed, the success of the journal during the 19th century and the advances in medical care during that century were indeed founded on that legacy of colonialism and slavery. And that history, I need to say it up front, I need to understand it, I need to embrace it, and we collectively need to address it as a journal. Because it's one part of the structural racism that's endemic in medicine, medical science, and global health today. Now, this theme issue that we've published on racism in medicine includes nothing less than quite shocking research evidence of the effects of racism on health. You know it, but it's still important to say it. Racism kills. Hatred kills. Discrimination kills. But it's interesting already, just in the last 24 hours, to see the reaction to this issue. We have, apparently, on social media, swallowed the mind pathogen of 100% woke. We, again, one of our sympathetic critics, are apparently a credentialed cabal of fifth columnists intent on imposing the most toxic elements of America's pathological obsession with race and identity. So those are some of the comments that we're up against. So what do we do about this? I'd like to thank Professor Delan Devakumar and a simply brilliant team of authors, some of whom you're going to hear from today, who he assembled to write this series of papers for you. I'd also like to reiterate my thanks to my colleagues at the Lancet. It's also true to say that there are no simple solutions to the problems of racism in medicine. But the authors do provide a very compelling and powerful set of principles to govern, indeed to change our behaviour the moment we walk out of this lecture theatre today. And we're surely ready for this moment. It feels like something decisive is happening in our society right now, at least something decisive in the conversation we're having about our society. And examples are all around us. The Wellcome Collection recently ended what it described as its racist, sexist, and ableist exhibition about its founder, an exhibition that seemed to celebrate colonial violence and exploitation. A British member of Parliament is being asked to pay reparations to Caribbean communities as recompense for his ancestors' slave-owning abuses in the sugar industry. And then, of course, there was the reaction to those words uttered at a Buckingham Palace reception recently. So where are you really from? And the discussion about race and racism that's erupted just within the last 24 hours after the launch of that Netflix docuseries. Yet this opportunity to put racism at the very centre of our concern in health and indeed in politics could easily be lost, because sections of the media have launched what they call a war on woke, that pillories, that mocks, and that stigmatizes anybody who seeks to question or investigate histories of colonialism, slavery, and genocide. The threat doesn't only come from the media. The current government's vicious anti-migrant language and policies are overt and populist racism, designed to appeal to an imagined constituency it sees as crucial to its survival. The publication of this series, the launch of this special issue today, is a beginning for us, not an end. We have a considerable body of work planned for the future. We won't get everything right. We are certain to make mistakes. But we are sincere in our commitment to embed the principles set out in the 4 papers you're about to hear about. We are sincere in our commitment to live up to those principles and implement them in our organisation across all of our journals. Let me conclude. Just a mile or so from here, for the very first time at the National Theatre, a black director, Clint Dyer, has directed a production of Shakespeare's Othello. He presents a radical reappraisal of what some critics see as Shakespeare's most racist play. But I would like you to consider going to see that play. Because in Dyer's interpretation, Othello actually becomes a play about a black man living in an oppressively racist white society. A black man who endures constant racist abuse. Indeed, a black man who is betrayed, who is ridiculed, slandered, hated, maltreated, accused, and abhorred in his society. The play shows how this perpetual debasement leads to his catastrophic physical and mental breakdown, with tragic consequences for those he loves most of all. In Clint Dyer's hands, Othello is a play about the impact of structural racism on one person's health. It is evidence, if you needed it, to show why Lancet Series is of such momentous importance for us all. And let's get on to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Right, so, Dylan, we're going to hear from now racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and its determination in health. Dylan Kumar, Professor of Global Child Health at UCL and the founder of Race and Health. Dylan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pam. So this first paper, we're going to talk about the structural ways in which racism, xenophobia, and discrimination can affect health, focusing on history, law, and politics. But before we get into that, in this talk and in this series in general, we talk about structural racism, we talk about some quite abstract concepts. But I want to bring it down to the more personal level first, because this is very personal. We went out and we asked people from around the world to tell us what racism means to them. And we picked a few audio clips which I'll play now. But this is going to form part of a repository which anyone can submit their thoughts to in the future.
El racismo para mí significa definir a otro como distinto y diferente a mí, de una manera tal que vale menos como persona. Por ejemplo, en Chile, donde yo vivo, crecí en una familia donde el tener color de piel blanco, ojos claros o color de cabello claro tenía mayor valía, y yo, siendo morena, sentí desde muy pequeña que yo entonces era menos bonita, o lo que decía o pensaba importaba menos. En el espacio profesional también he sentido experiencias de ser definida como menor valía por ser latina en Europa, lo que hace que uno viva la vida desde un lugar de más miedo, de mayor inseguridad sobre lo que piensa, hace o dice.
Racism to me is the beauty standard that we have in Samoa. If you look more indigenous or local, people will treat you in a way that is less than they would treat a foreigner.
My first awareness of racism was as a young brown child visiting the UK. It was to feel judged or watched every time I went into a shop or boarded a bus. It was to know implicitly that I was considered to be a different category of person than the members of a more powerful majority. It was to feel that I had to be an exemplary representative of my minority group who was deserving of acceptance, and to know that I always had to be alert to my precarious position. When I returned to live in Sri Lanka, my situation was completely reversed. I was privileged to be a member of the majority, and it was my neighbors, friends, and colleagues from minority groups who lived with the very real possibility of violence that could threaten their homes and lives.
I recognize racism in our school systems, but in the form of colonialism. As a Ugandan citizen, we were colonized by the British, which means that we had to adopt the British education system. However, years after we have gotten our independence, we are still, to a larger extent, being taught with the same education structure, which to me feels just not right. To a larger extent, the education that most Africans are getting is still colonized, so it makes it very unrelatable to young people.
Racismo é que é errado a gente falar mal da pessoa só por jeito que ela é. É muito errado. Então eu ia falar pra professora quem tá fazendo racismo pra ela conversar. E é isso.
Growing up as a young South Asian child in the UK, it was experiences of verbal abuse. It was sometimes physical abuse as well. But my family also come from Sri Lanka, and there it's very different. They come from minority groups who were targeted in an attack which they were very lucky to survive. So in many ways, racism is one of the reasons I'm here today, and in another world, I wouldn't be here today. So what do we try to do in this series? Racism, xenophobia, and discrimination critically impact the health of minoritized people. And by minoritized, I mean people for whom there's been an erosion of economic, social, political power because of their identity. But this is something that's relatively ignored by the health profession, something that we don't consider normally in our clinical interactions, in our public health work. And that's something I'm hoping that will change going forward as part of much broader discussions on the topic. I also wanted to think about racism in a global health context. This is something that happens in every society, everywhere. There are similar forms of categorization based on caste, indigenous status, migratory status, race, ethnicity, religion, skin color that happen everywhere. And the people at the bottom of those hierarchies are the most affected. And finally, to think about it in a structural way. We tend to think about our personal experiences, but underlying those are the root causes. And if we want to improve the conditions for most people, we need to look at that structural level. So after starting the series in 2020, there were a couple of big events happen. The COVID-19 pandemic, in which particularly East Asian people were targeted by verbal, physical abuse, and then the killing of George Floyd, which sparked protests, Black Lives Matter protests in the US and then around the world. But this isn't just about a few bad people doing some terrible things. This is about how racism runs through societies, the fundamental and deeply rooted systems of oppression that lead to the death of innocent people. And COVID-19 was maybe the most stark reminder to us about this. This is data from the Office for National Statistics in the UK, which shows mortality by ethnic group. And we see that Bangladeshi women had a 4 times increased risk of dying compared to white British people. And Bangladeshi men had a 5 times increased risk. And why is this? Some people attribute it to the biology of those Bangladeshi people. But really it's about the structural racism and discrimination that those people face. The fact that Bangladeshi, Pakistani people are more likely to work in the service industry, more likely to get the infection in the first place, more likely to live in crowded households and transmit the infection. And then once they get the infection, more likely to face barriers to access a health system, more likely to have underlying health conditions that the next presenter will go into in the next talk. So we see the structural racism underpins the mortality that people face. So in this series, we went through a number of different definitions. We described the ways in which racism, xenophobia, our understanding of these terms. So racism being an organized system that affects power and privilege, affording hierarchy to those at the top. Affording privilege to those at the top of the hierarchy. Xenophobia being a similar concept, but based on the fact of being an outsider. And discrimination being where there's differential treatments or outcomes that favor certain groups over other groups. This is not about what someone thinks. This is not necessarily about what someone says. These are the systems that underlie it. And for racism to exist, we need racial categorizations. And these go back to the 1700s, to Blumenbach, to Linnaeus, these ideas of color that Blumenbach described. And then Linnaeus went one step further to talk about how certain groups may be melancholy, maybe merry, maybe crafty, and of course, Europeans sanguine, muscular, inventive. It's important to say that these are social categories, these are political categories, these are not biological categories. In this series, and in this paper in particular, we talk a lot about history, about some of the impacts that history has on today. And one thing I wanted to pick out was eugenics, and that's particularly important, being a member of staff in University College London, the historic home of the eugenics movement. Francis Galton, the famous statistician, described how eugenics deals with what is more valuable than money, lands, namely the heritage, high character, capable brains, fine physique, and vigor. It aims at the evolution and preservation of high races of men. Of course, those races of men were similar to himself. And it divided people into two groups, those who are worthy to give life and those who are not. And this has consequences that go on till today. Famously, within the US, there was forced sterilization of black women, of indigenous women, and the Mississippi appendectomy, in inverted commas, where black women received hysterectomies that went on until the middle of the 20th century. There was then an inquiry in UCL about this that shows how eugenics lives on till today. It's implicated in compulsory sterilization, legislation on mental deficiency, immigration law and racist policies, the notion of natural intelligence, the normalization of segregation by race, ability and class. These are concepts that live on and inform society as well as science and medicine. So in this series, we came up with a new conceptual model based on decolonial theory, anti-caste theory, critical race theory, and we looked at some of the underlying social ecological models, in particular, ecosocial theory by Professor Nancy Krieger. And one important aspect is that we flipped the model. Instead of the individual being at the center, we put the individual on the periphery, and we focus much more on the structural causes of the health outcomes that we face. And Dr. Salvaraja will go into much more detail in how those health outcomes play out in the next presentation. Outside the structural core, we have institutions, particularly the health system, and then we have the people, communities, and individuals on the outside. We then have this concept of intersectionality that runs through the model, and the third presentation, Dr. Shannon, will describe that in more detail. And finally, we have this concept of the life course, from birth up till older adulthood, and then intergenerationally. And being a child health doctor, this is particularly important for me, that these critical periods in life can affect your health much later, and then where we intervene has to be early in life with long-term outcomes. So then looking at structural discrimination. So this is the high-level processes and systems that maintain racial inequality and inequity. And we have these two main concepts of separation and hierarchical power. Separation described by the Musqueam indigenous community in Canada about how humans can see themselves as being different from other humans and also different from other animals and nature. But separation happens a lot. But what's important is that there's a hierarchy imposed where some people are deemed to be better than others. The original racial categories I told you about places white Europeans at the top of that hierarchy. And that's important for some of the colonial ideologies that took place over the last few centuries. This idea that those people over there are less worthy than us here, and led to the idea of racial capitalism, the idea where economic and social value can be extracted from people based on their identity. And we see this most obviously in the slave trade, and linked to the scientific and medical industry, how people from Africa were deemed to be less prone to diseases, so they would be good to go to the Americas to work there. And finally, we talk about law and governance. There have been racist laws going throughout history, famously the apartheid laws that segregated people according to their race. But laws can also be useful in counteracting this, and Professor Abubakar will come back to the role of law and policies in the last presentation. And finally, power and politics. Someone asked me recently, why now? And of course, the answer is not why now. This has happened for centuries. But there has been a difference. There has been a difference in recent time where populist leaders come up with rhetoric that scapegoats others, that's divisive. And this could be on the basis of race, of religion, of indigenous status, of migrants. And this populist rhetoric leads to real health outcomes for the populations they serve. So finally, in conclusion, racial categories are biologically arbitrary, but the discrimination minoritized people face is very real. Underlying these are similar systems of oppression based on separation hierarchies. And to fix this, we need to really look at the structural causes. Hatred and intolerance have real and deadly consequences. And it's important for us as a health community to take that responsibility to try to challenge and address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. The next person we're going to hear from is paper 2, Racism, Discrimination, Xenophobia, Mapping Pathways to Health Outcomes. This is Dr. Sujatha Silvatra, who is an obs-and-gynae doctor and founder of Race and Health. Sorry, muffed up your name.
Thank you. I'm Sujatha Silvaraja. There's nothing I'm going to say today that's particularly groundbreaking. There's nothing extraordinary. There's nothing really that's revolutionary. 3 days ago, I asked an open AI platform to write me a speech on racism and health. And actually, if you have a look, it's pretty good. It actually aligns with everything that we have to say in this series. And I ran the search 3 days ago, and our work only came out last night. So much of what we're saying is not new. Black people, indigenous people, minoritized people, we've been saying this for years, for decades, for centuries, and today we're building on work. We're building on those who've come before us. We're building on the work of Audre Lorde, of Frantz Fanon, of Angela Davis, of Yin Paredes, of Ambalavana Sivanandan, of so many of those who've been saying this for so long. There's injustices in credibility, injustices in the way that knowledge is produced. That's why, for so long, racism and discrimination have not been mainstream public health issues. That's why, when I tell people at work that I think, hey guys, I think discrimination affects health, senior clinicians, senior colleagues have ridiculed me. That's why when I was on shift just a few days ago on the labour ward as the obstetric registrar, there was a Sri Lankan Tamil patient on the labour ward, who was complaining of feeling sick, of feeling like she wanted to vomit, that she had lower back pain and this overwhelming urge to open her bowels. Those are all well-recognised signs of labour. She wasn't believed to have been in labour. We examined her far too late, and we only identified quite late on that she was, in fact, about to have a baby. What our series does do, what it is it's a synthesis. And it brings together, like Dylan said, anti-caste work, decolonial work, anti-racist work. And it brings it and it matches it to a global synthesis, a global evidence base, mapping it to health outcomes. Placing this work within a well-recognized institution such as the Lancet. That's credible, that's new, and that is powerful. At the heart of our work is our conceptual model. It's often easier to think about racism at the individual level, right? We can kind of comprehend prejudiced beliefs. Some of us understand that we've got unconscious bias against certain communities. Sometimes we think racism, discrimination, that's a problem over there, but not quite over here. But the evidence is global. Discrimination is everywhere. And instead of thinking of it as one or two rotten apples, we need to understand it as a system that's rotten to the core. Sometimes when we think of structural discrimination, it's quite difficult to grasp. It feels intangible. Our model aims to make the incomprehensible comprehensible. It aims to make what can so often feel invisible, visible. As Delane said, at the center we've got these two concepts: separation, where as humans we can see ourselves as separate from one another, separate from the other organisms, other species, the ecosystems in which we live. And then two, this concept of hierarchical power. In society, we've got hierarchies, ladders. And at the top of those ladders, those people are given power, privilege, opportunities, and health, and then less so for those at the bottom. Now, these ladders haven't just come from anywhere. They've been created. Delane told us about how colonialism has contributed to it. We know that academia and science and healthcare professionals have propped up these ladders. So when we have a new report that says, shock, horror, X organization is institutionally racist, yes, you should be horrified, but why are we shocked? Every institution and system not only shape our health, but they're shaped by these broader structural processes. Culture, for example, has a massive role to play in shaping our health. Culture in the form of Othello productions, as Richard mentioned. Culture in the form of British Vogue under the leadership of Edward Enninful and Vanessa Kingori, which has led to massive representation of Black and minoritized people in the mainstream media. Culture in the form of Michaela Cole. This next clip has references to sexual violence. In just 2 minutes and 7 seconds of television, Michaela Cole challenges the scientific fallacy that Black people are all so different that their kidneys work differently from the rest of us, and that's why they're at high risk of blood pressure. This is incorrect. This is not evidence-based, and the evidence that does support this is shaped by those broader structural processes of discrimination. She shows us the absurdity of how we imprecisely categorize people and populations. She emphasizes the significant role of life stress in determining health. She shows us, via the medium of TV, how health systems can be undermined by discrimination. The evidence for this is, again, global. Discrimination undermines how acceptable healthcare. It undermines how accessible it is. It undermines the availability of resources, and it also undermines the quality of care given. We also know that minoritized health workers, as well as being affected by discrimination, they're also agents of discrimination in the health systems. We also know that so much of health and health systems are affected by broader things. There's so many other systems that affect our health, right? We know that income, employment, education, that all affects our health. But the way in which it does depends on where we are. It depends on where you live, right? And we know that discrimination actively places minoritized people in closer proximity to air pollution, in closer proximity to toxic waste. We also know that minoritized people have got less access to green spaces. That is what this level of spatial determination speaks to. Now, in this series, we're looking at certain power hierarchies that are based on categories related to caste and indigeneity, and the ones we've already mentioned. But in the real world, there is a lot more than just that. There are lots of ladders that exist out there, lots of power hierarchies. So if you're finding that so many aspects of your identity constantly keep coming on these lower rungs of these ladders, well, then actually your disadvantage is only going to continue to be compounded. And that is how intersectionality cuts across our society. We've had an overview of the pathways of discrimination, from the structural to the individual. I want you to think about those as the inputs. We're going to map them onto the outputs, the health outcomes. But in order to get there, we need to understand as individuals how we process these inputs. How do we respond to these pathways of discrimination? And as individuals, we tend to respond in three main ways. We respond in how we behave, right? We respond in how we sleep, how we move, what we eat, who we spend our time with. We respond psychologically in how we think. We can internalize those ladders. We can internalize the beliefs that proximity to whiteness gives us power. That's how colorism exists, right? We respond to these pathways in our physiology. The body perceives this discrimination as stress. And what our body does is it activates our fight and flight response, something that was intended to be an adaptive behavior of humans. Our cortisol, our stress hormone shoots up, our adrenaline shoots up, our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure goes up. And if this is sustained and it's frequent, that's called our allostatic load. We know there are associations between allostatic load and minoritized people. How do you measure allostatic load? Indirect measures, whilst not specific, relate to increased BMI, insulin resistance. More direct measures relate to daily cortisol variations, blood pressure, heart rate, lower levels of HDL cholesterol. Our bodies respond to discrimination with epigenetic changes. Every human has their genetic code, right? And epigenetics refers to how that code might be read. It refers to differential gene expression as a way of which we're adapting to our environment. We know there's associations between epigenetic aging and discrimination. That's where your biological age will exceed your chronological age. We know there's an association with telomere shortenings. If you imagine your chromosomes as two shoelaces crossed over like that, think of these telomeres as the plastic tips on the end of your shoelaces. Discrimination is associated with the shortening of these plastic tips, with the shortening of your telomeres, and the shortening of your life. So we know now the pathways of discrimination. We know how we respond to them. So what are the health outcomes? What are the outputs? Well, the health outcomes associated with discrimination exist across all ages. That Sri Lankan Tamil patient I told you about on the labour ward, she were to experience racial discrimination in her life and in her pregnancy, her child is more likely to have a higher level of cortisol in their blood at 6 weeks of life. The effects of discrimination are intergenerational. We as minoritized people were bearing this burden even before we've been born. There's associations between discrimination and maternal death that related to blood pressure disorders. There's associations with discrimination and babies being born too early, too small, being born with congenital anomalies. And in childhood, there's associations with psychological distress, anxiety, early drinking, asthma. And in adulthood, that's if you make it there, because there's an increased rate of mortality associated with discrimination at every stage of the life course. There's also a lag between when you experience the exposure of discrimination and by the time your body processes that as outputs. So in adulthood, we've got outcomes like stroke, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure again. And in older adults, there are associations with cognitive impairment and dementia. The health outcomes associated with discrimination are overwhelming, but also an underestimate. And it doesn't matter what part of health, what part of medicine, what part of society you take up space in, this is relevant to you. For so long, we've been trained to understand that these health outcomes have got risk factors. We understand some of these risk factors as being modifiable, the ones you can do something about, so diet and exercise and sleep. And then there is the risk factors that are non-modifiable, the ones you can't do anything about. And this is often where we find race and ethnicity. For so long, we've been trained to think that this association between ill health and minoritized people is primarily to do with genetics. Maybe sometimes someone has spoken about socioeconomic factors, maybe someone's even spoken to you about discrimination. But the way that we fundamentally understood this is upside down. We have massively under-recognized the role of discrimination, the role of interrelated socioeconomic factors in explaining this relationship. This is important. Because if we can take these things, these associations that we've been trained to think is inevitable, if we can change what we've been taught to think is non-modifiable and make it modifiable, if we can work towards a world that instead of centering hierarchical power and separation, if at the core of our world we've got equity and togetherness, well then that is groundbreaking. That's extraordinary. That is revolutionary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gosh, I was blown away by that. Fantastic. Right, so the next paper is Intersectional Insights on Racism and Health, not just a question of identity. I'm going to hand it over to Jordan Shannon from the Institute for Global Health at UCL. Jordan.
Thank you so much. I want to start with this slide. I'm standing here on behalf of this incredible group of people from all around the world. Rosemary Morgan, Koi Mariah, Zara Zanali, Leanne Brady, Marcia Teresa Koto, Delan Devakuma, Benida, Oscar Kardag, Mal Mukherjee, Maria Fernanda Torino Perez, Marcello Ringobam, Nidhi Sabawal, Amos Schoenfeld, Pamela Silwane, David Singh, Manya van Renneveld, Siasanya Vilakati, and Chelsea Watergo. In addition to recognising these amazing people, it's also customary where I'm from, Australia, to start with a recognition of the traditional owners of the land, an acknowledgement of country. Now, we're a long way away from my home, but I do want to recognise and pay my respects to Yagara elders where I was born and where I grew up, the elders past, present and emerging. Also Waka Waka, Jawan and Walpri, people, friends and colleagues who have taught me so much. The acknowledgement of country also contains a recognition in Australia that sovereignty was never ceded and that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. But I was reminded recently by a colleague that this type of acknowledgement and this type of recognition can't just hang in the air alone. It has to be paired with effective pathways to action. So I hope that, at least in some small way, this paper provides that link and bridges a reflection on the issues and the challenges at hand and the complex factors, to be frank, and provide some way to map pathways forward for action for each of us, no matter our backgrounds. So we were tasked with an interesting paper, which is to tell a lot of different stories from all different parts of the world and to thread them together into an intersectional analysis. We started with the concept of racism as a system of oppression, and I think Delan and Sujita have really outlined that well, in that if we think of historical and organised patterns of mistreatment and conversely privilege, we can actually identify the way that the system itself operates and change it, rather than simply focusing on the outcomes. But the one thing that global health and development seems to be pretty good at is dealing with these different types of experiences in isolation and in silos. So we might look at discrimination based on race in complete isolation to discrimination based on gender, for example. And we all know that we don't live those types of lives. We're complex beings with complex factors in our lives, and we need a way to deal with that complexity. So that's where intersectionality comes in. It recognises that we all have unique experiences of discrimination, but that there are commonalities, firstly in the way that these different systems of oppression operate, but secondly that there is a way to understand the confluence of these factors in each of our lives. So, intersectionality. It's an action-based framework, and I think understanding it as that is also a way to help bridge thinking about the problem and acting on the problem. Intersectionality encourages us, and in fact rejects the analysis of single distinct factors, and encourages us to focus on the relationships between mutually constituting processes. Whilst recognising identity is really important, it positions identity in a larger system where there are intersecting systems and structures of oppression. Instead of just focusing on distinctions between groups, it encourages us to call in, to integrate all of these complex factors in our lives. It encourages us to move from a problem analysis to evidence-based action. And finally, by enabling us to recognise all of these complex factors, it values and upholds different ways of knowing and different ways of knowledge production, which is really important. We were inspired by the CREOR, Canadian Research Institute for Advancement of Women, their intersectionality wheel, which is here on the right. Now, this is another type of socio-ecological framework thinking, where at the centre of this framework is everyone's unique individual circumstances. The second layer of this model looks at different forms and categories through which people experience discrimination or conversely privilege. So age, disability, ability, migration status, race, sex, gender. But this is wrapped in these larger systems, these systems of oppression. So ableism, racism, homophobia as examples that create the hierarchy, that create the discrimination and that shape everyone's individual experiences. But these systems don't just emerge out of nowhere, they actually are shaped by even larger structures that we all operate in. So our legal system, our economic system, our increasingly globalized economic system, colonization, etc. So understanding all of these multiple layers and how they integrate was really important. So how does one actually do that in a paper? So what we did is we developed a series of place-based case studies that outline in depth the complex challenges that different groups of people are experiencing. And we created case studies based on 5 global locations, which I'll explain. Our author group focused on intersecting systems of oppression, the levels at which racism and other forms of discrimination operate, the impact on health that they had, and the potential pathways forward. We developed case studies in separate groups, which I'll recognise in a moment, and then brought this together in a group-based analysis where we drew out key themes about intersectional systems of oppression. So here we are. We have a case study from Australia that looked at the experience of the Aboriginal mother in institutions, particularly the health and legal system, and looked at discrimination not only based on Indigenous status, but also the intersection with patriarchy and in the context of Australia as a colonial nation. Brazil, which we'll see a video from my colleagues in a moment, looked at discrimination based on skin colour and how it intersected with class, age and gender. In India, we looked at socially excluded groups and caste-based discrimination and how that intersected with gender and class to influence the experience and the exclusion of women from healthcare services. The South African team focused on xenophobia primarily, but in the context of COVID-19 response in Cape Town, and how under a really intense socioeconomic pressure and a history of apartheid, combined with class, migration status, both documented and undocumented, and skin colour combined to influence the experience of a lot of people in Cape Town. And in Europe and North America, we looked at discrimination based on religion and how that intersected with gender, language and ethnicity in the creation of health outcomes. So David Chelsea from Australia, Nidhi and Mala from India developed the case studies. Leanne Manya, Eleanor, Siasanga and Pamela from South Africa, Marcelo, Maria and Marcia from Brazil, Ozge, and also supported by Ben and Amos from North America and Europe, and the analysis supported by Rosemary, Zara and Koi. So I'm going to share now a video with you from our Brazilian team, Maria, Marcia and Marcelo, that goes into depth around their case study and the intersectional aspects of that. It's followed up with a song by Elza Suarez, who was described by Maria as the Queen, and she refers to the intersecting aspects in a really powerful way of racism in Brazil. And I will note that this case study does refer to police violence.
This case study focuses on lethal police violence in Brazil. Our country has a long history of racism. Criminal violence, police brutality, and incarceration policies are some of the ways structural racism is expressed. Most of the victims of homicide and lethal police violence in Brazil are men, black, younger than 28 years, with less than 3 years of formal education and resident of peripheral and vulnerable area. Just to give some figures, in 2014 and 15, the police were responsible for more than 6,000 homicides in Brazil, and in the city of São Paulo alone, figures changed from 400 and almost 800 considering the information source. Racism and other forms of oppressions operates in Brazil in distinct levels, such as structural. Brazil carries the legacy of the social and political dynamics of a slave society. This heritage is present in all dimensions of social and institutional lives. Geospatially, we can highlight the existence of area of spatial segregation, institutionally reflected as a stigma related to young black men in urban area. This is part of a racial selectivity of public security apparatus, which reproduce centuries of racial oppression against black people. And individually, considering that racism results ultimately in unjust death of low-income young black men. The racial bias connects to generation, gender, education, and social segregation, composing a complex intersectional structure in the conformation of vulnerabilities to lethal police violence in the city of São Paulo and in Brazil as a whole. We identify 5 intersecting axes of oppression: coloniality, racism based on skin color, discrimination based on age, gender discrimination and the patriarchy, and socioeconomic discrimination. Policies to face racism and discrimination in Brazil must be intersectionality informed. This means that the analysis of social inequities needs to be carried out in conjunction with a critique of the colonializing, capitalist and globalized system of subordination. This is a characteristic of Brazil and also other low and middle income contexts. It seems crucial for us to include a multidimensional social analysis in health inequality research.
So thanks to Maria, Marcia and Marcello for that. So we have 5 of these really deep case studies in our paper that I hope you'll be able to get into soon. So how do we tie this together? So the findings that we were able to thread together, the key things that came out. Firstly, that it's really important to understand history and coloniality, and there is this popular reckoning with that right now, but that all of the post or colonial countries had experiences of racism that were deeply shaped by these historical experiences. Separation and hierarchy, Delan referred to this, how between groups othering can occur, and how that creates the ability to create hierarchies across shifting lines of identity privilege. Institutionalization, so the internalization through systems, including our health system, about who is worthy and how different forms of health law, etc., can be practiced that are discriminatory. Visibility in the body, so both Delan and Sujita have referred to this as well. It's more than skin deep, yet what is visible can be used to discriminate. And beyond that, the body itself being a site of political action and resistance. And finally, violence. So not only direct forms of violence, such as outlined in the Brazil case study, but also being facilitated by cultural normalization and structural violence, the prevention of the attainment of the highest level of human being and health that could be possible based on race-based discrimination. So we pulled this all together and we used the same inside-out socio-ecological model where at the core was this deep structuring practice that gets done by systems and institutions that create space-based inequities and concentration of inequities that is embodied by people over the course of the life and is cut across by violence, intersectional forms of violence. So as a bridge, we asked our authors what could be done and what are the pathways forward. And here are a few of the suggestions. Taking an ecosystem approach to addressing discrimination. Thinking about racism as a key determinant of health rather than a peripheral determinant. Intersectionality-informed policies in all policies. Culturally sensitive and Indigenous or Black-owned services. Multidimensional analyses in health inequities research, public awareness campaigns, peer-led support and advocacy, availability, accessibility of services, alternative accountability mechanisms that dismantle rather than reinforce discrimination, inclusion and representation in decision-making, always critiquing colonizing capitalist and globalized systems of subordination, and centering community-led knowledge and response. Action across borders is possible. We've seen from Black Lives Matter and centuries, quite frankly, of these transnational movements of solidarity, focusing on root causes, and as Sujita said, thinking of them as modifiable. And each of us who operate in the health world forcing us to go outside the walls of our hospital or outside the walls of our disciplines and really engage with these issues as a matter of life and death. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. And finally, the fourth paper, Confronting the Consequences of Racism, Discrimination, Xenophobia on Health and Healthcare Systems. Ibrahim Abubakar, the Dean of the Faculty of Population Health at UCL. Thanks, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Pam. So like the previous speakers, I want to start by acknowledging the immense contribution of colleagues. Our paper, unlike the previous three, also benefited from the work of all the three papers because ours is an attempt to say, well, where do we go from here? What do we do to confront racism and its effects on health? We started, like any other review paper, with the premise that we will do a PICO, what we call Population Intervention Control and Outcome Analysis, and do a systematic review of the evidence. But we soon realized that when you look at the evidence base, it is largely focused on a specific part of the world, i.e. the rich Western world, and specifically North America, and B, actually for a vast majority of areas, there isn't any evidence to look at. And we came back right to the beginning, which is the structural and underlying determinants that our models said we should look at. So it is our clear conclusion that the focus of any addressing of the issues of racism and health has to be the structural determinants that underpin the hierarchies of power. We believe that if you are to challenge the underlying issues that affect all of us, you have to challenge the ideologies that underpin discrimination and that therefore address those that deny the importance of this issue. We believe that the health harms are mediated by structural determinants underpinned often by centuries of oppression. And if you are to solve this problem, you have to recognize that there is ages and ages of history that underpin all layers of discrimination. And this cannot be fixed by just health system interventions alone. And they have to be on the wider determinants of health as it affects the whole of society. We also agreed that action has to be multi-sectoral and society-wide. Otherwise, we would not be solving the problem. So on this slide, I purposely start with the picture of our Home Secretary, and I hope by the end of this talk, I won't be stripped of my British nationality. That aside, I want to make a wider point, which is that for racism to gain hold, for discrimination to gain hold, some of us in minoritized groups have to contribute and enable racists to continue their actions. And any one of us in absolutely any position of influence will know that you get individually approached and given carrots as to how you should play ball so that you enable all of these wrongs. And it's only by saying no that we can continue to fight the evils of racism on health. Going back to our model, I think having looked at all of the dimensions, possibly for me, the most important issue and the most important approach that we can take to address the ill effects of racism, xenophobia, and discrimination on health is actually the law. There are numerous instruments. This is a universal problem, but so is this solution. Most countries have signed up to legal instruments, in particular human rights laws, which is what our Home Secretary is actually attacking. But the United Kingdom, as many countries around the world, have signed up to these instruments. And it is our responsibility to think through how can we use these laws to address the impact of racism and health. Laws help us because A, they are normative and they can create a common ground for the whole world as to what we must do. And B, they allow you to be able to hold governments, to hold society, and to some degree the private sector to account. And therefore, laws are definitely a part of the solution. Of course, I'm not claiming that laws cannot be used negatively. There are many examples in health where laws have been used to penalize elements of health. But laws used appropriately are really the key tool to make a difference. We also specifically looked at institutions and systems, and we found many, many interventions that are effective, which we summarize in great depth in the paper, including interventions around education, housing, income, policy reforms in prisons, drug policy, and training of healthcare workers to show how they can do things differently. We think all of these are important, and we all need to advocate for them to be implemented. But we also think there are major gaps in that evidence, and that the funding is needed to make sure that we get better answers to what you can do within these wider determinants that affect health. Sadly, as I alluded to at the beginning, when you look at specifically individual community and healthcare interventions, actually the evidence base is quite thin, and we attempted to summarize what we could find. That is not to say there are not multitudes of interventions and very rich literature, especially in the US and the UK, that address the issue of what do you do to disadvantaged groups who are often minoritized groups. So just because those interventions do not specifically tackle racism, we're not suggesting that they are not useful in addressing the health needs of minority groups. We're saying, yes, we need them, but they have not been evaluated specifically as to the effects on racism and health. In the paper, we thought one way to summarize all of the discussion is not to reinvent the wheel, but to try to think through, are there key measures and actions that society ought to take to address the issues of racism and health? And we came up with these 6 issues listed on the slide. And that is not to say we are reinventing that wheel, and I believe that there are many in this audience that can talk for an hour on each of the items I listed here. But for us, it summarized the key actions that we think collectively we need to join up and take together to make a difference. The first one is decolonization. This characteristic pervasive othering of people that is underpinned by the desire to establish hierarchies and to put others at disadvantage is really, really critical. And if we are to be serious about changing it, we need to start at the very underpinning of colonization, because many, many of our mindsets are underpinned by the colonial structures. As part of the writing of this paper, we took the view that we actually need to take a step back and reflect on those of us at UCL, with all of the privileges we enjoy, are probably also part of that problem, and that to write well about this issue, we need to reflect on our advantages and our privileges. Second, justice, and I've talked about this. We need to make sure that we use law, but we need to be open to the idea that it's not just about implementing existing laws, but also thinking through how we reimagine the creation of knowledge. And it'd be great if that is done not just from the perspective of the Western viewpoint of law. Obviously, we want the changes to be transformative. We want the changes to be reparative. Where there's historical wrong, you want compensation. But the idea that you can only see the world through a Western viewpoint, through a capitalist viewpoint, through a punitive legal system, it's not really the answer to all of the problems. So where appropriate, we need some measure of compensation, but there are other philosophies around the world. For example, the work of Escobar and colleagues using native ideas and philosophies, where they talk about approaches that are not necessarily involving punitive measures, but people reconcile and reach agreement. And many, many traditional societies across the world actually come up with these answers. So we need to think beyond Western philosophies and ideas if we are serious about tackling racism and discrimination globally. We need genuine diversity and inclusion, not tokenism, not the occasional representation. Of course, I recognize that representation is important because it is how you inspire the next generation by people being able to see others like them. But we think it needs to go beyond the token individual, and that systems are changed when you talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion. I think Jordan has done justice to the issue of intersectionalism. But while we think about all of the dimensions of intersectionalism, it's really important that you don't lump all of us together, that you address and appreciate that when we suffer disadvantage and discrimination, it's compounded by all of the other characteristics that we all bear as individuals and the different dimensions of disadvantage that therefore affect each other. That means that we don't suffer equally from discrimination. Fifth, anti-racist action. Now here, it's surprising how often people come up with very effective measures to fight racism, and then you realize that, oops, the right have organized themselves, the political right, I mean, and are fighting back. I mean, for me, if you do that and you get that reaction, what it says to me is that you are actually pressing the right buttons, and what we need is to organize ourselves and do even more. The reactions that Richard mentioned at the beginning to this series is absolutely the right reaction, but we need to be prepared because this isn't new. If you go back to post-emancipation in the US after the end of slavery, it's not surprising that the Jim Crow laws came up because those that are beneficiaries of those inequalities are going to fight back. It's normal and natural that they enjoy that status and therefore they want ways to continue to enjoy that power. And what we must do is to recognize that that would be the normal reaction. And our response has to be, how do we make sure that we create a new world where it's not about a zero-sum game of they lose and we win, but that there is better equality and everybody benefits from a new system and a new world where everybody is equal. Finally, and most importantly, I think we must take a human rights approach, and this is about law that I was speaking to earlier. Absolutely critical that in all our arguments about how we change the dimensions and how we change future, we go back to human rights law. There are excellent instruments that all our countries have signed up to that we can use to effectively fight racism. So my last slide is, where do we go from here? I think it's really important to be clear about what our priorities are. There are so many things you could do, and for us, the conclusion is that we need to select those subsets of action that are completely transformative. Touching the issue at the margins is not going to make a difference. We must be clear about those things that would transform society and ensure that we get rid of the harms that racism produces. We also need better quality evidence in health interventions to address all of the issues that have been alluded to about how clinical practice is actually based on all of the wrong evidence. We need the right research so that people are treated in our health establishment without the ill effects of racism on health. Finally, we commit, as part of the authors and the group that have come up with this commission, to a number of actions. The first is we would walk through race and health, ably led by Professor Devakuma, and we will seek ways to bring a community together to hold society to account. And in doing that, we'll call for metrics and measurement of actions that organizations agree to. We'll align ourselves with multilateral bodies so that the actions are global. And we'll come up with a commission that is focused on racism and health, but with a specific area where, with our life course approach at UCL, we want to focus on kids. And this commission, working with the Lancet, will complement another Lancet commission led by the O'Neill Institute, which is on the broader issues of racism and health. And we hope that these two complementary efforts would be used to A, generate better evidence, and B, hold society to account on anything they agree to as metrics. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ibrahim. Thank you to all the speakers. Can we just give a round of applause? What fantastic speakers. Okay, thank you. Before I show the next video, just to remind everyone, the QR code here is up for questions, which we're going to have a panel discussion immediately after the video you're going to see. So please get your phones out, scan it in, think of something and send it to us. And now I'm going to hand over to the video, and I just push this green button. Okay, great. Thank you. So this is, as I said before, it's a conversation with you, is it, Dylan? And authors from Brazil, India, and South Korea. Sorry.
So thank you all for joining me today. Can you describe the context that you're in and the settings, and tell me how these issues play out where you are? Nidhi, please.
So in relation to the Indian context, the most disadvantaged groups are those who are lower in the caste hierarchy. So those who are the scheduled caste, which are former untouchables in the caste hierarchy. Other backward classes, which are lower in the caste hierarchy, but they are not really experience stigma of untouchability, and the scheduled tribes whose status resembles indigenous groups in other countries. So in terms of significance of the historical context of the disadvantages experienced by the population groups, the caste system is a system of social hierarchies developed in the Indian subcontinent over 3,000 years ago, and it involves the social division of people who could be considered to be of the same race. And historically, in this system, the social and economic rights of each individual caste have been predetermined by birth and have been hierarchical based on principle of graded inequality. So a belonging in the caste group determined individual merit, privilege, and disability. So in the traditional scheme of the caste system, scheduled caste, that is the former untouchables, suffered the most due to the notion of untouchability. And the Constitution of India recognizes this burden of social stigma and economic backwardness of individuals belonging to these disadvantaged social groups, and provide and guarantees equality before the law. And it overturned the customary rule of the caste system and provided legal safeguards against discrimination, as well as affirmative action measures to improve socioeconomic status of the socially disadvantaged groups.
Thank you. Sung-Sup, could you talk about your experience in studying in South Korea?
Thank you, Dylan. So when you ask me who are the most disadvantaged groups in South Korea, my answer would be it depends on political social context. let me talk about the case using the example during COVID-19. In the COVID-19 situation, there was widespread stigma on Asians. So Koreans might be victim of anti-Asian crime in US. So as you know, in US, hate crime against Asian increased more than 70% in 2020. But on the other hand, inside South Korea, in the early days of COVID-19, foreigners could not buy government-supplied masks at pharmacy. So they experienced discrimination. In this case, Koreans might be perpetrator. Another case would be that in the early days of COVID-19, the Korean government sent emergency text message several times, but only in Korean. So foreigners in Korea could not have access to critical information. So when we talk about which group is the most disadvantaged, I think it is important to take into consideration political and social context.
Brilliant, thank you, thank you. Priscilla, tell me about Brazil.
Yeah, similar to India and Korea, we need to look at history to understand how racism has been playing a role here. And it's important to understand that Brazil had 300 years of slavery, and it has been only 134 years that we don't have slavery. So our rules and even the laws that protect people from discrimination and racism are really, really new. And I think it helps to understand. I like Silvio Almeida's discussion. He's an academic from Brazil, and he discusses the economic role that structural racism has in maintaining privilege for some people here. And even though we were talking about racism, about slavery, which happened a long time ago, we can still see modern cases of racism. So this still works to make sure that some people has privilege, that some people are still earning money. Racism helps some people to keep the status quo and to keep earning money, oppressing others.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for describing all the context that you're in and the different groups who are affected and also how history can lead to this. Can you tell me a little bit how these racist ideologies lead to ill health in the populations that you're in? Maybe Nidhi, back to you.
Thank you. So while there is protection, and these groups are protected in the Constitution of India, they require additional safeguards against caste and untouchability based discrimination in access to health services, such as, like, for example, the Safe Motherhood program. The empirical evidence shows that women, especially from the scheduled caste group, that is the former untouchables, as a result of the stigma of untouchability, have unequal and discriminatory access to health services, those services provided in this Safe Motherhood program. For example, evidence research suggests that they receive fewer visits by the upper caste providers than the prescribed minimum norms on the antenatal care or postnatal care services. At the stage of giving birth, differential treatment gets reflected by scheduled caste women, what they experience being placed in a socially segregated spaces of birth, away from others. They're asked to share bed or lie on the hospital floor. They are asked to be assisted by their own community women or DIEs, the traditional birth helpers, rather than by trained midwives or a nurse. They face abusive language, and sometimes health workers refuse to touch their newborns for cleaning and immunization. So all the issues around pollution, pollution, and also the notion of untouchability gets reflected in these forms. The other important aspect of the social segregation and exclusion is the location of the healthcare centers are more often in the vicinity of the upper caste residences in villages, which further limits access to women from the former untouchable group to these health services. We have been arguing that there is scope for devising policies that ensure non-discriminatory access of women from the socially disadvantaged groups, because we see that there is access, but it is not discrimination free. It's important that there's non-discriminatory access of women from the socially disadvantaged to this safe motherhood program, for example, to reduce existing inequalities in maternal and child health outcomes.
Thank you, thank you. That's very tangible examples showing real effects to women and children in this example. Sing-Sup, maybe you could tell us a little bit.
Yep. Dishi mentioned about healthcare access issue, and in addition to those issues, there are some issues about working environment in South Korea. So currently in South Korea, there are nearly 2 million foreigners living in Korea, and the majority are migrant workers from China, Vietnam, and Thailand. I'm an occupational health researcher, and whenever I take a look at government statistics about fatal injury rate, the number is getting better over time. But I think the number does not reflect the injury of migrant workers. Korean employer hire those migrant workers at very low wages, and those migrant workers are doing very dangerous job without personal protection. And if they got injured, they are kind of expelled from South Korea with their injury. As a result, official government statistics about injury rate would be getting better over time, but it may hide actual terrible injury among migrant workers. But that would be something I want to delve into in my research.
Thank you, thank you. And Priscilla, same question to you, please.
Here in Brazil, we also see structural racism being an important cause of life conditions, more poor life conditions. And then we can think about racism as a social determinant of health. And historical oppressions have been leading to long-lasting inequalities, exclusion, and social vulnerability among indigenous and Black populations. And therefore, they're more affected by diseases that could be prevented by actions of health services, such as tuberculosis, infectious diseases, and undernutrition. Also, diabetes type 2 and hypertension are more prevalent among Black and women and men. And we have national data showing that Black people have live in households without garbage collection, water supply, and sewage. And we also see violence, like the chance of a young Black man dying from homicide in Brazil is almost 3 times higher than a young white man. And then we can also look at the health system and see institutional and interpersonal racism. So we see quality, a lack of quality in the prenatal and childbirth care to Black women in comparison to white women, with less appointments and exams for them, not being allowed their right to companion during birth, and having less application of anesthesia during birth also. Maternal mortality is especially problematic among low-income, Black and indigenous women, as well as women living in rural areas and in the north and northeast regions of Brazil. And because of all these contexts, sometimes these women not even search for medical care in fear of being mistreated. And similar to India, we can also see unequal access to health units and the lack of training to professionals to take care of these populations.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you all for describing the issues in the places that you're living and working in, and how these play out in terms of poor health. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dylan. That was great video to show to us. Right, so we're going to have a panel discussion. We're running a bit over time, so we're probably going to shorten the first panel Q&A, but try and extend that into the next one. So could I ask the 4 authors to come up onto the stage? Okay, so let's see. A question for you in terms of how the series could be used. What would you like clinicians to do following the publication of this series?
So I suppose I have a very simple task, is just to think about this. And I say that because as a clinician, when I did histories, I didn't think about this. I thought about, and I think pediatrics does it very well. Think about the environment, we think about family, we think about air pollution to a certain extent, but I never thought about discrimination. I never thought about the context that people are living in. And I say that as I know clinicians are very busy, and I know it's a very hard job, and I know this is something else, but this will improve the lives of your patients. Are they, like Sujitha described, the situations that she's working in, migrants who come to this country who don't have the same access as other people here? So I think one thing is purely to put this on your radar, to think about how you can affect and improve the lives of your patients. The other thing that's linked is to advocate, because you can have a voice, and health professionals are powerful. In many societies, some of the most powerful people in those societies. And you can join organizations, you can work within your local environmental government, but you can change things. And so I think twofold. Maybe Sujitha, you probably have other answers.
Yeah, I've thought about it. I think about it all the time. I think of every interaction I have with a patient that's from a minoritised background as an interface with centuries of all of these pathways, of all of that discrimination, right? So it's not only an interface with everything that's happened before, but it's an opportunity for you to reckon with that. And like Dylan said, it's an opportunity for you to use the power that you've got to listen to them as an individual, not using these broad stroke ways of thinking about people. I'll give you 2 examples where I think where we've done work and where change has been made. At Race and Health, members of Race and Health were involved with consultations with NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. After those consultations, we've removed race as a variable to calculate kidney function, but NICE is still recommending race in part of its guidelines for blood pressure medication. So change has been made, but more change needs to be made. And at the hospital I work at the moment, instead of using guidance that doesn't take into account ethnicity, there's individualized algorithms that have overall reduced hypertensive disorders in pregnancy, overall reduced incidence of stillbirth, but actually flattened inequities between black pregnant women and white pregnant women.
Great. Anyone else want to say anything?
I'd like to add to that. So a lot of times when we kind of have clinical guidelines based on race, they're actually proxies to something else that they haven't measured. And then they generalize and actually sometimes cause harm to the majority of people in that race, because perhaps the majority of people do not fall in that subcategory. So I'd call on clinical academics to actually do more research in this space to challenge those blanket practices that use race as a category when actually what they are trying to correct for is a particular issue that may be socioeconomic or maybe genetic or maybe a combination of the two. Almost certainly socioeconomic and wider determinants have a part to play, and then we kind of lazily use race as a proxy for things we are observing. So I think we need more evidence to challenge those wrong practices.
I might also jump in here just
Yeah,
for
sure.
balance, and just to say that we're really physicians are really good at looking at outcomes, but looking at the inflows into this. And there are really great examples emerging that break down the barrier between the walls of the ED and people's lives, dealing with the social determinants of health as a health and clinical issue inside the hospital. So, for example, systems and projects that look at homelessness as the determinant of health and how the emergency department in our hospital can actually respond to that. So there are great examples coming out there for practical examples and practical ways that clinicians can actually think of this as a key part of their role.
Great, thank you. Let's ask a question from the audience, if we can. How do we resist the epistemic injustice produced by races, classes, hierarchies of evidence? Lived experience, community knowledge is considered less than objective to RCTs with objective measures.
Well, maybe. Look, intersectionality is what we did in this paper, and I think we grappled with the way that we tell stories using different forms of knowing and different forms of evidence. And I think, being aware of the fact that there is a knowledge hierarchy and that certain forms of knowledge get marginalised, but centering the story of people and what makes us human and being able to find commonalities in those stories, not simply through large-scale data sets or RCTs that control for as much as possible, but embracing the complexity and the essence of what makes us human, I think is going to be central to our response to racism and other injustices.
Should I
have a go at this? Yes, please do.
So I think we need the Lancet, we need New England Journal of Medicine, we need the BMJ, we need NICE to actually tackle this issue. So I want to flip the question and say, how do you change that base? Because those hierarchies are informed by the powers that determine what evidence is. Now, if you think about society in general, and if you think about how policy is made, they're actually based on stories and human. That's why journalists, that's why newspapers start the most powerful stories with the stories of individuals, because that's the thing we relate to most. So I think all of the other evidence areas that should inform our decisions already exist, and society is amenable to it. And we need to take that into account, as we do with the hard facts that the journals and the guideline groups do. And we need those that hold the power to decide which of those two get a hearing, to change the system so they hear both.
Something for us to think about. Thank you. Right, let's have a sort of funding and researchers question. So for funders, how can funders help rework our global health practice and decolonise our systems of work, especially for those global North funders working in global South countries?
I actually wonder if we could ask that question in the next panel.
Oh, okay.
We have Shamari from the Wellcome Trust.
Yes, no, good point, actually.
Very ably able to answer that.
No, yeah, let's keep it for that one. So for researchers, yes. What recommendations do you have for researchers and health workers working in settings where people are reluctant and even offended by discussions and suggestions about including practices to combat discrimination in our work, such as designing research or treating and diagnosing patients?
I think two things that are helpful. Last night, I was interviewed on LBC about the findings of the series, and actually the presenter asked me about the health economics argument. So we've outlined that so many of these health outcomes are chronic diseases, and actually it's affecting millions of people around the world. It's costing us so much money. So that's one argument that you can use. And then the second one is that of safety. That's one that's very helpful, particularly coming from a maternity space. We find that sometimes when we talk about discrimination or racism, it can be quite polarizing. But if we talk about the safety of our populations, that tends to be something that most people can relate to.
Good answer.
Think about this the other way as well, is that certain populations may not want to be part of research and studies, and we have to be very careful, mindful of the histories of those groups, the abuses, forms of violence that they've suffered, and think about how we can engage people, to improve health. And that's what we're trying to do. But rightly, people might not want to be involved. So we need to think about that very carefully.
I'd just add also, this work is uncomfortable work. You know, I mean, Pam, we had a reviewer saying that when you look at all of the health outcomes, it looks like a dirty laundry list. But actually, this is the reality of millions of people around the world, and it's not clean. It is uncomfortable, and people are not going to feel nice about it. I think we have to also acknowledge that in how we're going about things.
Another audience question here. What lessons can we learn from history about how we respond to those who try to discredit or silence this work, such as the anti-woke discourse?
So I think I alluded to that in my talk. I think when that group starts organizing, you know you're pressing the right buttons. And I think that too often, those of us that want to make a change, those of us that want to improve things, give up when you get the incessant attack. I think the answer lies in not letting the messengers kind of be shouted down, so that if we have an effective messenger articulating the right evidence-based ways to improve things, that we need to collectively come together and support those individuals so that they are not shouted down to silence. Obviously, the personal toll on those advocating the message can sometimes get quite high. Therefore, you recognize that there are instances when those individuals, we need to keep quiet because it's taking too much of a toll on them. But we have to work together as a group to counter the message. Otherwise, it won't get heard if it gets shouted down effectively.
Yeah, great. This is a good question. This is for all of you again. Some might say that racism is isolated to certain parts of the world, notably the US, and at worst irrelevant and non-existent elsewhere. What challenges do you foresee in applying this work to public health globally when there seems to be significant reservations and denial that it even exists? How can the health community support this narrative in our work?
That's what we're doing today, right? We've got a massive review that says the health outcomes are global and it's everywhere. And when we have pushback that denies its existence, when we have pushback about anti-woke pushback, I think that's how racism operates. Toni Morrison said one of the ways that racism works is by distraction. So instead of doing what we need to do, all of a sudden we come off track and we have to defend ourselves and say, actually, oh, it does. No, I promise it does. Let's just assume that it's here and do something about it. Same argument for climate change, right? Same here.
Yeah, the other response is they tell you to wait.
Yeah.
It would happen later on. You have to say, no, it has changed now.
Yeah, ask us peacefully, ask us nicely. Yeah.
Jordan, just a couple of questions for you, just because there are a few that seem to, they want to know, our audience wants to know how you selected the regions and areas that were included in the paper. Was there a reason, for instance, for the lack of East and Southeast Asian representation? Why was religion chosen as the main category for Europe and North America?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And also, just to recognise that when we do select, or when we do use things such as case studies, it is trying to really get down into the nuance of one particular context and to tell one particular stories. But these stories are infinite and we couldn't tell them all, and I wish that we could, and I hope that we can through platforms such as Race and Health. So we used our network and we used the expertise in the groups of not only academics, but clinicians, activists, first-line responders and community members themselves to tell us these stories, and it emerged out from there. As a series, we did look at the overall balance, and you'll note that we do have a panel from East Asia in paper 1. So we looked at not only the balance of authorship, but also the balance of perspectives, and I hope that this is the start, not the end of the sharing of these types of stories.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Jordan.
Can I just come on that as well? By choosing the things that we have chosen in the third paper, but across the whole series, we aren't in any way denying that there are issues in other communities, that there are problems, and we're not putting them in any kind of pedestal that this one is more important than another one. We tried to cover lots of issues. Sometimes we try to pick examples that are not so common, but we can't cover everything, and I think we just have to say
No, we
that.
wouldn't let you. You go over our work out. Great. Yeah. Thank you. Right, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop there. There's some great other questions. Thank you all. But we've got another panel after this. So thank you to the authors. And We are now going to swap places. We're now going to swap chairs.
So Pam and I are now swapping. Shamari and Michelle. I can see Michelle. So let me introduce the panel. To my right, we have Shamari, who's a Research in Culture and Communities team at the Wellcome Trust, utilising research evidence and insights to ensure that positive and inclusive cultures are baked into design and planning of Wellcome's research programme. And I will come to you in a moment with that question on funding. We have Dr. Michelle Khan next, who's an associate professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, visiting faculty at the Aga Khan University in Karachi, and an associate fellow at Chatham House. Michelle is a social epidemiologist with extensive experience in quantitative and qualitative research to strengthen health policies and systems. Online, we have Mr. Ken Henshaw, who's Executive Director of We the People, a non-governmental organisation based in the Niger Delta cities of Port Harcourt and Calabar. Ken's worked closely with communities over 17 years in the Niger Delta, especially in communities where oil and gas have been extracted for decades with devastating environmental health consequences. And we have Dr. Roger Kosler, who's the director of the International Institute on Global Health at the UN University. Roger works on global health and inequalities through intersections of research, policy, and practice, working particularly on global health development, gender equality, health equity, and human rights. And finally, our chair, who is now a panelist, Dr. Pam Daz, who's a senior executive editor at the Lancet and oversees the global health work in addition to public health, international health policy. And Pam founded the Lancet's racial equity group, GRACE. So my first question to each of you in turn, and maybe I'll start online. Roger, can you hear me? Yep. Just really to describe the issues in relation to your own institution within the UN, and then briefly some of the solutions that you think we might be able to push going forward.
Thank you, Dylan. And let me start by congratulating you and the entire Lancet team for this much-needed discussion and evidence that you have shared this afternoon. I really would like to start by a quote which is in Richard Horton's editorial to this series, which in my view not only summarizes what we are talking about, but also in many ways summarizes how these issues do tend to manifest themselves in different institutional contexts. And the sentence I wanted to quote is where he says, "The issue shows how systems interact with each other to perpetuate inequalities." And I think this goes to the heart of the matter that we are trying to talk about. This afternoon, multiple presenters have talked about different manifestations of discrimination, racism, or xenophobia, and in a way looked at structural elements related to it. I would like to challenge us a little bit further as I come into the UN as a space, and may I look at multilateralism more broadly, is that we don't need to limit ourselves by looking at only the structural. We need to look at the subliminal as well as part of it. Not only the explicit, but also the implicit that we are talking about. Because often the structural is easier to deal with. It's the subliminal that actually is much more hard to identify and address meaningful pathways to solutions. If I come from that perspective and I look at multilateralism as a space overall, there are three sets of issues I would like to flag. And I know our time is limited, so I'll try and be brief. The first is the issue of voice. And when you look at the issue of voice within the multilateral system, you have multiple things that start branching out. The first is the issue of language and expression. You know, it is a system dominated by English as the primary language. Even though there are 6 other languages that we are supposed to meet, there is a culture of dominance. It's not only the language that is the issue here, but it is also your accent. It is also, how often have been asked, where are you really from? And the behaviorism that comes with that. The second is the issue of representation. Who gets represented in these forums, in these discussions, whose voice and where? And that's challenging because even when there are leaps of faith being made in terms of bringing diversity, equity, and inclusion, we find that it tends to get limited to those persons of color or those representing minority voices in global north institutions than actually those from the southern hemisphere. Then the third element that comes out of is the structure of domination. You look at the HR practices, the recruiting patterns, you almost have an impenetrable space that starts to emerge. I hope I will have a job by the end of this presentation. The issue of the space itself. It's a very closed space. You know, people far more eloquently than I have written about issues of visas, issues of lack of access to these multilateral forums. But visa isn't the only issue. Look at the cost. For many of those coming from global south countries, it's almost an unimaginable thing unless you have a funding attached to it. The other is the networks and cliques that the system operates through. And it's very difficult to understand it if you don't know what it is about. There are networks which tend to oscillate, whereby you will have a privilege to certain pedigree of candidates that come through the system and not for the others. You will have a long pedigree of people coming from Ivy League institutions, but not from Makerere, not from BRAC, not from Delhi University. And the question is why? Or is there lack of talent? Is there lack of imagination? Or is this just a lack of willingness to do what needs to be done? The third is the set of issues in terms of leadership that emerge when you look at multilateralism as a space. And it's not only individuals in leadership roles, which continues to be an aberration because there is a very strong hold of the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council and who gets to be at the helm of some of these institutions. But it is also about how decisions are made, how funding is structured, and issues that emerge out of it. And if you look deeply, then unfortunately, an image that starts to emerge is that of a white savior model that seems to be very right within the structures and echelons of power. Very briefly, to answer your second part of the question, so what do we do about it? I think first of all, let's recognize there are no silver bullets. But while there are no silver bullets, I really think what we need to do is by recognizing that these are not individual instances of racism or discrimination that we are talking about. It's part of a pattern, it's part of a power structure that purposefully discriminates against certain sets of people. So next time, when the director of Africa CDC is harassed at airports in Europe, or when a bulk of people don't get visas to attend a health systems conference, we need to understand what does it actually manifest. The second is we need to link our movements together. We have a tendency of working too much into our individual silos, too little together. There is much being said by brilliant speakers previously on how we need to do that. I think we really need to put it into practice. And my final point is, at the heart of it, if you peel off all the layers of issues that we've talked about, it tends to become a conversation about how do we shift power and how do we share power and what would it take. Tokenistic gestures are just not going to wash anymore. We need meaningful, transformative change, not only within the secretariats of these institutions, but within the conduct of member states when they present themselves at these institutions, who tend to use these institutions, quite frankly, as a fig leaf to help them.
Thank you.
I'll there and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ken, can I come to you with the same question? Just to briefly describe the problems that you're facing and then ideally its solutions going forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My apologies, you may hear some background noise. I'm actually in the airport and suffering from a 7-hour flight today. Well, so which thing? So I lead the Niger Delta of Children. As you all know, the school board has been structured from over 64 years. First state has been built up distinction extract colonial decision.
Can you switch the video off?
Sorry, Ken, we really can't hear you very well. I'm wondering if maybe if you turn off your video.
Just to say that oil extraction was done as part of a broader colonial racist policy. At no point in time were the indigenous people of Nigeria consulted in the decision to extract crude oil. So from the very start, it operated as a repressive act against indigenous people who were considered at the time as backward. And something like gas flaring, which has been a byproduct of crude oil extraction in the Niger Delta and has continued for 64 years, was recognized from the very start as an abuse on the rights of the indigenous people. It was recognized, it was documented, but nonetheless, a decision was taken that gas flaring will continue despite its health consequences. I grew up in the Niger Delta and I grew in an estate just a fence away from where Shell officials lived. It's called Shell Estate. In this Shell Estate, you have swimming pools, beautiful buildings, 24-hour power supply and all that. In the broader space in the Niger Delta region, these things simply did not exist. And the majority of the Shell workers were all white. And so we are black, living next door in rural communities without electricity, without healthcare, right? This was racist in nature from the very start. And growing up, there was something called Shell hospitals. These were hospitals dedicated specifically to be attended by Shell workers and their kids. We couldn't attend Shell hospitals because our kids, our parents didn't work in Shell. Even something as simple as healthcare was segregated in the Niger Delta of Nigeria. Yeah? So oil sites, places where oil is extracted from the Niger Delta, were considered some kind of sacrifice zones where pollution, where the most obsolete systems of crude oil extraction was permitted. Right? Now, the dirty business of crude oil extraction can be done without the level of consequences it has had in Nigeria's Niger Delta region. And if you have any doubts about the consequences, all you need to do is read the UNEP report on Ogoniland released in 2011, which documented massive health impacts of crude oil extraction. In fact, the report said that benzene, a cancer-causing chemical, is in the water people drink 900 times above safe levels. And this is not just in Ogoniland, it's in every part of the Niger Delta region. Crude oil extraction has been carried out with the most reckless and mindless attitude without any care or attention to the health consequences for the people of the Niger Delta region. And the evidence is significant. So life expectancy in Nigeria is one of the lowest in the world, standing at about 54 years. But in the Niger Delta, where oil companies have operated, life expectancy is between 41 and 46 years old. Deaths are, simply like very, very common occurrences in that area.
Thank you.
One key element of the racial policy is that when an oil spill occurs, the company blames it on local communities, right? And my argument is that the racist policies of the oil and gas sector has, been a significant determinant of health outcomes in the Niger Delta region. So looking forward, what will happen? I think the first step, the oil and gas sector in my country has operated as a deadly mix of racial policies and discrimination. That realization will lead to some kind of framework to address the circumstances, the health difficulties, and the environmental degradation that have been repeated by 64 years of oil extraction. That's the route I think that we need to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ken. Pam, can I come to you next in terms of, from your position at the Lancet, but looking at health journals and the industry in general?
Yeah, thank you. Some of the issues actually that I'm going to mention have been mentioned by the other speakers. So it's a commonality that we're seeing, whatever place of work that you're at, but certainly the system of hierarchical power, as you explained so powerfully in paper 1, it sadly operates at every level of publishing as well. The capitalist world that we currently live in there is the linguistic power, as Rajat also mentioned, where the power of English language over every other language, is something we just can't get away from. There is an epistemic power where there's only one type of knowledge which we privilege and prioritise by the academic community. Again, that was mentioned with one of the questions, that sort of empiricist-based quantitative studies that journals like the Lancet prioritise, RCTs and the like. So we're also working in a system that is quite Eurocentric and patriarchal. So, the Lancet is an English-speaking journal predominantly and based in a high-income country. And although we consider ourselves very much a global health journal, we are surrounded by these biases. And that's what we're up against. In terms of what we're trying to do internally in our processes and practices and the journal overall, we made, like many other journals and many institutions in 2020, after the events of both Floyd and COVID, big grand statements about committing our efforts towards fighting racism. And we made several commitments, including around equity, diversity and inclusion. And following up on those commitments, we are doing several things and have been doing several things for quite a while. One of them has been diversifying our authors, peer reviewers and editorial advisors. One thing I know Michelle is her area of interest is data collection and publishing. We're really struggling with publishing some good metrics and data because we all know that data metrics are so valuable for understanding diversity and inclusion in our practices, remediating kind of unfair biases and driving greater equity in research and publishing more broadly. But we haven't had those data collection systems. What's great in the last few months, our electronic submission system for authors now allows researchers to self-report their data on their gender, ethnicity and race. And so hopefully we'll have some data within 6 months to a year that we can really publish and examine. One really positive thing we've done recently is our portfolio of journals. We now have these regional titles. So we have journals across the world and they're led by editors in those countries. So again, that's our attempt of trying to decentering our operations from London HQ. The other thing is Grace. You mentioned I co-founded Grace. We're a voluntary internal group of editors from minority backgrounds. I don't think any other journal has something like that. It's composed of about 15 editors, and among the several other things we're doing is looking at recruitment, because I have to say that the Lancet is not as diverse as it could be, and that is a problem. And so we're trying to work with HR to, really examine our processes, see why it is that we're not pulling candidates from minority backgrounds. Our argument on one side is that, we can only appoint people who apply for the job. And so if nobody from minority backgrounds apply, then we can't appoint them. But there must be more that we can do. And I guess that's sort of the things that we're sort of currently looking at. The only issue with Grace, sadly, and I think this happens in a lot of organisations and institutions, is that we are a voluntary group, but somehow there is this sense that we're going to solve all the problems of this big entity of our publishers, and that shouldn't be the case. Everyone needs to be committed to this issue, and we all need to be part of that change. So there is that danger that we're being looked at to make these big changes and tell everybody what to do. But we don't know ourselves. We're just, we are minority background people, but it really needs everybody to do so. So it needs much more of a top-down approach, and we hope that Grace and the way we're doing things at the moment will encourage that to happen more.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that we are over time, but if you could bear with us for the next another 10 minutes or so for the last speakers. Michelle, can I ask the same question to you? So I know that you've been working on decolonisation within your university as well, so if you could describe them.
Yeah, okay, but we're over time, so I will try and be quick. A lot of really important points have been raised, right? So one of them was around the hierarchies of knowledge, and I think that's something that is really a core issue in the higher education and sort of research community. So if we take a step back and think, why do people seek higher education? A lot of times it is to kind of get that stamp that I've been to a great institution, I've got that on my CV. And it's really striking how passing through a few institutions is a must to be able to succeed in, say, global public health, or to be really seen as an expert, even sort of in medical research. And likewise, if we think about academia and publishing, so if you've got a Lancet first author on your CV, it kind of can make or break you. And I think perhaps all of us as individuals also need to reflect a little bit on what do we consider expertise, and can we challenge that a little bit? People from other institutions, people that aren't publishing, people that aren't writing well in English are also experts, because often they are much closer to the communities. So that's something that because what creates an expert is in the minds of people it's up to all of us. So I think that is one issue that perhaps these institutions continue to perpetuate. On the flip side, I think there's not enough attention given to the role of some sort of countries that have been involved in colonization, or even to date some of the institutions, in the role that they've played in extractive policies in creating the status quo. So when we talk about, say, hard to reach populations, and that phrase, in terms of teaching, are we focusing, or we should be focusing much more on having people understand what perhaps neglect or what sort of policies have led to certain groups withdrawing or certain countries being underdeveloped. So not enough attention paid, and how different would a global public health course look if it had a core module which was all about the role of the country that you're sitting in right now and the institution that you're in, what role have institutions like this played? It would really change the way the students that are going out, I think, do the work that they conduct. So final point in terms of looking forward, it's already been mentioned that we do need more evidence, because I think we need to really build a case for why this is important. I'm not sure how long the equity argument is going to keep us going. I'm really afraid that this is going to be something that in a few years we forget. So I think we need evidence to say why this is actually important for institutions to do, to make us better at the work that we are doing. So funders really, I think, have a big role to invest in this, but also as individuals, Professor Abubakar had touched upon the personal risks and the work that individuals have done. And so even if you're somebody that doesn't have access to any funding or feels like they don't have much power, you can support people by doing things like following them on Twitter, or when you see them at a meeting, just saying that the work is important, because it takes a huge toll, and by speaking out, a lot of doors are being closed for certain people. So if you do find yourself in a position where you can open a door, do it, because it's a really important time for people who are speaking out right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle. And finally, Shamari, you work in an institution that does have power. And so it's the same question to you, and also the audience question. How can funders help rework our global health practice and decolonize our systems of work?
Cool, so I'll come to the elephant in the room first. So I work for the Wellcome Trust. Saying the name Wellcome probably means that you know four things right now. The first of which is that we're very rich, with a £38 billion investment portfolio to do our work. The second is that we fund research into mental health, infectious disease and climate change, and a broad-based discovery research. But the third and fourth things are probably that we've recently subjected ourselves to a review that says that we're institutionally racist, and we recently shut down our one of our exhibits in the collection that basically was a shrine to Henry Wellcome. And I say that to more or less get to the point that research funding, the positions that funders like Wellcome put themselves in, very much operates as another arm of white supremacy. What counts, and not just in the funding itself, who gets the funding and how it's structured. It also leaks into what counts as a good idea, the very framing of scholarship and research excellence, and all of that manifests itself in historical inequalities that favour certain groups and certain peoples over others. Welcome is no exception to this. So, for example, I make constant reference to the fact that 2 years ago, back at the height of the COVID pandemic, Welcome funded 0 black British researchers at all, so that's 0 researchers that look like me. And even since then, whilst things are getting better in the light of our new strategy, award rates for white applicants remain over 4% higher than all other racial minoritized groups that apply for our funding, with black British researchers making up the lowest sense of this. I too don't want to be fired, so I'm going to go straight into talking about some of the things we're trying to do about it. So Welcome set up 3 ambitious goals around this, both being around an inclusive employer, an inclusive funder, and funding research that's inclusive in design and practice. Increasing the diversity of who we fund and people's research careers is really important to improve the relevancy of the research that we're funding. Examples of when that hasn't worked out too well will be during the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw quite a lot of cases for people trying to understand why people from certain ethnicities were dying at higher rates than white populations, and lots of funders put lots of money into that, only to then say that actually none of that funding went to any black people, which speaks to so many different levels of the multitude of the topics we've spoken about today, so I won't go into that too much detail, but yeah, ultimately it's a problem that persists throughout academia, and yeah, we're trying to address that. As part of our work to try and improve the approach of how we fund, we really are trying to encourage our researchers and our decision makers to take on more self-scrutiny and develop a more meaningful consciousness about why different funding disparities exist and where bias can appear in our processes. And one of the most exciting pieces of work that I think we've done recently is actually put out a library of inclusive research and funding inequity practices that are basically a guideline for different funders to try and do to try and improve how equitable their processes are. Beyond that, I really liked the point that Ibrahim made earlier about the need to widen up our view of research excellence and take a greater appreciation of the different types of scholarship that can contribute towards good ideas, something that's also been shared across this panel as well. And so we're really trying to think about that in the context of our work with ethics and openness and research culture, really trying to encourage our researchers and put it more at the forefront of our application forms to encourage people to be thinking as much about the metric output of research as much as the personnel and who's involved in the design of the work in the first place. I will skip over a few other bits to come over to not repeat myself too much. But yeah, I would summarise by basically saying that all of this work requires a lot of investments in time, money and resources and planning to be achieved. And there's lots of really, really passionate people, both inside and out of the academy, who are really keen on making this stuff work and getting things to be a lot better. And I'm really privileged to be one of those people that's trying to do this, and also my wonderful colleagues here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, unfortunately, we've really run out of time. We've gone way over time. So thank you very much to the panel here, to Raja for joining incredibly late in Malaysia, for Ken for joining from an airport, Pam, Michelle and Shamari here today. And I've got a few thank yous and then I'll just finally close. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us in person and all the people who joined online as well. You know, we really do appreciate that, you taking your time to come here. There's drinks and food outside if that's what you came for as well. Thank you to the Wellcome Trust for supporting this event and funding it. Thank you to the Lancet, to Richard Horton, originally for believing in this project and supporting us throughout the 3-year period. We wouldn't have got to where we are without that. To Pam and to Liz Zuckerler before her, who were our editors. Huge amount of work goes into these kinds of series and to the special issue overall. And you know, I think you don't appreciate that unless you're in the system and get to see some of it. Also, thank you to some of the other editors, Manit Verdi, Mabel Chu, Poppy Craig, Simon Huck, and the entire team. I never had any idea how many people there were at the Lancet until I started with this. Thank you to all the series authors. You saw a handful of people today, but there's a huge number of people who put in many, many, many hours of work into getting this to where it was. And also to the reviewers who also, we don't know who they are, but put in a huge amount of work there as well. And finally, thank you to the Race and Health team. So Race and Health is a non-profit organisation run through UCL. With our focus is to disseminate, to educate, to advocate for some of the academic work. But particularly some of the people, to Meetha Hawke, Sonora English, and then at the front desk, Abhi Devanayagam, Susanna Corona-Maioli, and also Chetna Sharma behind the scenes. These events don't happen without these people. So thank you very much to all of them. So finally, I thought I'd try to end with something a little bit more positive. Talking about racism can be very depressing, let alone experiencing it. But given that we're in the World Cup, I thought I'd end with a football quote. So the Brazilian team is actually playing right now, I think, as we speak. And they've courted a fair amount of controversy recently with the appropriation of the shirt in the recent presidential election. But I want to talk about one of their super talented young black strikers, Vinicius Jr., who's faced a lot of abuse recently for his goal celebrations. And I thought of reading out some of the quotes, but I won't do that. But what I will do is read out some of the responses from other Brazilian players from the past. So from Ronaldo, the great striker, "Your dance does not disrespect anyone. Racism does. It disrespects, excludes, hurts, and kills." And Pelé, the greatest player, who's currently pretty unwell in hospital in Sao Paulo. "Although racism still exists, we will not allow that to stop us continuing to smile. We will continue to fight racism, fighting for our right to be happy. Dance, Vinny, dance." Thank you.
Wow, well done, well done.